I never should have looked at her phone. But there it was, sitting on the kitchen counter, buzzing with notifications like a flashing red light. I wasn't the kind of man to snoop, at least I wasn't before all of this. Trust was never something I questioned in our marriage, until now. The house was quiet, too quiet. Clarissa had left early, saying she had a meeting in the city, something about a new client she needed to impress. I didn't think much of it at the time, after all, she was always good at her job. Managing our image, making sure everything was in place. We had built this life together, brick by brick, winery by winery, and I trusted her with it all. But something had changed after the wine festival last month. There had been an unspoken distance growing between us, a subtle shift in the way she looked at me, touched me. She seemed distracted, often on her phone, smiling at texts she never bothered to explain. At first, I brushed it off. We'd been married for years, people change. Life gets busy. But that nagging feeling in my gut only grew stronger. Something wasn't right, and today, I found out why. The phone buzzed again. Luca's name flashed across the screen. My blood ran cold. Luca, the charming winemaker from the festival. The one we had invited to showcase his rare vintage, the one who had enchanted everyone with his stories, his laughter, his wine. I remember Clarissa standing by his side, smiling a little too much, laughing a little too loud at his jokes. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, just part of her natural charm. But now, that nagging feeling from the last few weeks was back, stronger than ever. I picked up her phone. My hands shook as I unlocked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but I knew I had to see it for myself. And there it was, an endless stream of messages between her and Luca. Flirtations, inside jokes, late-night plans. My heart clenched as I scrolled further down. Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again. Same place tomorrow? Miss you already, babe. I dropped the phone like it burned my hand. The weight of the words crushed me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't harmless flirting. Clarissa had been meeting him, spending nights with him. And I, the fool, had been blind to it all. I stood there, frozen, staring at the phone as if it might suddenly erase everything I had just read. The room seemed to close in around me. The walls of our perfect home. My home, now feeling like a cage. Every image of our life together played back in my mind, shattered by those words on the screen. Betrayed. That's what I felt. By the woman I had spent years loving, building a future with. By the man I had welcomed into our lives, thinking he was just another business partner. The rage didn't come right away. At first, it was just disbelief, a dull ache in my chest as the truth settled in. But slowly, steadily, anger bubbled up inside me, pushing away the shock. How could she do this? How could he? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? As I stood there, alone in our empty kitchen, one thing became clear: I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to be the silent, humiliated husband. No, I had something better in mind. Something public, something they'd never forget. I grabbed the phone again, this time not to read more, but to plan. The next wine festival was only weeks away. They thought they could keep this affair hidden, but I was going to make sure everyone saw them for what they really were. My hands steadied. The plan was already forming in my mind. A plan that would turn their secret into their downfall. Clarissa and Luca had no idea what was coming. I stood on the patio of our vineyard estate, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear over the rolling hills of grapevines. The evening breeze was gentle, carrying with it the familiar scent of oak barrels and ripe fruit. But that night, the calm didn't bring me the usual peace it once did. It reminded me of the wine festival. The night Luca walked into our lives and everything started to fall apart. I remember how it felt, standing in this same spot during the festival. We were hosting guests from all over, wine critics, distributors, investors. Clarissa, as always, was the perfect hostess, moving from group to group, laughing, smiling, charming everyone with her wit and grace. And then there was Luca, arriving fashionably late with that signature bottle of his rare vintage that everyone had been talking about. He was charismatic, no doubt about it. The way he shook my hand, his confident smile. The way he held eye contact just a bit longer than most people. But it wasn't until I saw him with Clarissa that night that I started to feel uneasy. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, they were just talking, maybe even bonding over their shared passion for wine. But the way they leaned in closer than necessary, the way her laughter seemed a little too genuine, a little too bright, made me uneasy. Still, I shoved those thoughts aside. Clarissa was my wife. We had been together for nearly a decade, and I trusted her. But that night, as Luca charmed his way through our guests, I couldn't help but notice how often Clarissa drifted back to him, how her gaze lingered on him just a moment too long. By the end of the festival, they were practically inseparable, sharing quiet conversations in the corner, their heads close together like co-conspirators. I tried to convince myself it was harmless, that they were just talking business. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't until much later that I realized just how right I had been. In the days following the festival, Clarissa's behavior changed. She started spending more time at the vineyard, staying late under the pretense of helping with the new wine shipments. But when I'd come to check on her, she'd always be on the phone or rushing out, always saying she had something else to take care of. Then there were the excuses. Late meetings, unexpected dinners with clients, sudden trips out of town. At first, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She had never given me a reason not to trust her. But the distance between us grew with every passing day, and it felt like the life we had built together was slipping through my fingers. And then there were the texts. The laughter she shared over the phone, her smile at something I wasn't a part of. I didn't want to see the truth, but it was there, staring me in the face. She was slipping away, and it was Luca who was pulling her. I was left standing alone on the outside, watching as she drifted further and further from me. That night, weeks after the festival, as I stood on the patio and let the cold air numb the growing rage inside me, I made a decision. I couldn't let this continue. Clarissa thought she could play this game without consequences, but she was wrong. Luca thought he could take what was mine and walk away unscathed, but he was wrong too. The next wine festival was approaching, and this time, I was going to be ready. This time, I wouldn't be the blind fool. The weeks passed slowly, and with each day, I gathered more pieces of the puzzle. Clarissa and Luca were careful, but not careful enough. There were late-night calls she didn't bother to hide, and text messages she tried to delete. I watched, biding my time, knowing that soon I would have all the proof I needed. The affair had been going on for weeks, perhaps even longer. But the more I uncovered, the more disgusted I became. I started keeping notes, times she left, excuses she made, the lies she told. I needed to make sure that when the time came, I had everything in place. It wasn't just about confronting her anymore, it was about exposing her, making sure she felt the same humiliation I did. My opportunity came one afternoon when Clarissa said she was going to a client meeting. I didn't bother questioning her this time. Instead, I followed her. I waited until she left the house, watching as she drove away. Then I took my car, staying far enough behind that she wouldn't notice. We headed out of the city, past the vineyards, into a more secluded area. That's when I saw it, her car parked in front of Luca's villa. My heart pounded in my chest, the rage burning hot as I watched her walk inside. She didn't even bother looking back, didn't even think for a second that she might be caught. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, waiting for her to come back out. When she finally did, it was late afternoon. She walked out, fixing her hair, that same smile on her face she used to have after our romantic nights together. But this time, it wasn't for me. It was for him. I felt sick, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the moment. Not yet. I let her drive off, heading back home like nothing had happened. But I had seen enough. I had the proof I needed. That night, I couldn't even look at her. When she came back home, acting as if nothing was wrong, my blood boiled. She kissed me on the cheek, asking about my day, pretending everything was fine. I played along, knowing that soon, her lies would come crashing down around her. The next morning, I made a few calls. I wasn't just planning to confront them, I was planning something far more elaborate. The next wine festival was weeks away, and I knew it would be the perfect stage for their downfall. Luca was set to showcase another one of his prized vintages, and Clarissa, of course, would be there by his side. They had no idea what I had in store for them. I worked quietly, reaching out to old friends in the media, ensuring that when the time came, there would be plenty of eyes on them. I set the stage carefully, making sure every detail was perfect. This wasn't just about catching them in the act, it was about making sure everyone knew what they had done. The day of the festival drew closer, and with each passing moment, my resolve hardened. Clarissa's lies, Luca's arrogance, they would all be laid bare in front of everyone they thought they had fooled. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not this time. The days leading up to the wine festival felt like the calm before a storm. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Clarissa moved through her daily routine as if nothing had changed, as if her affair with Luca was still safely hidden. But behind the scenes, my plan was falling into place. Each detail carefully arranged, each piece of the puzzle where it needed to be. All that was left was to set the stage for the grand reveal. Clarissa was more distant than ever. She spent her nights out working late, and I no longer bothered to ask where she was going or who she was meeting. I already knew the answer. Every time she walked out the door, it was to be with him. My patience wore thinner each day, but I reminded myself that I couldn't act impulsively. The festival was only a week away, and if I wanted to make them pay for what they'd done, I had to wait. That week, the vineyard was bustling with activity. Workers prepared the estate for the influx of guests, setting up tents, organizing tastings, and decorating the outdoor space. The vineyard looked more beautiful than ever, with the grapevines stretching out in perfect rows under the warm sun, and I hated how it all felt like a mockery. We had built this together, Clarissa and I. This vineyard was our shared dream, the culmination of years of hard work and dedication. And now, it was where our life would come crashing down. On the day before the festival, I made my final preparations. I reached out to the journalist I had contacted weeks ago, ensuring that everything was in place for the event. He promised me a discreet presence, just enough photographers and reporters to catch the moment, but not enough to make anyone suspicious. I wanted the reveal to be sudden, unexpected. The press would be there to document everything, but the shock on Clarissa's and Luca's faces would be the true headline. That night, Clarissa came home late again, as expected. She smelled of Luca's cologne, a scent I had come to recognize all too well. She kissed me absent-mindedly on the cheek, muttering something about the festival preparations and how excited she was for the event. I looked at her, forcing a smile, my stomach churning with disgust. How could she stand here, in our home, and pretend everything was fine? How could she lie this lie so easily? Tomorrow's a big day, she said, her voice light. Luca's new vintage is going to be the star of the festival. Everyone's been talking about it. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. But I swallowed it down. Tomorrow was indeed going to be a big day, but not in the way she imagined. She had no idea what was coming, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Yeah, I replied, my voice steady. I'm sure it'll be a night to remember. As Clarissa went to bed, I stayed up, finalizing every detail in my mind. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the truth would come out, and there would be no going back. The day of the festival arrived with perfect weather. The sun hung high in a clear blue sky, casting a golden light over the vineyard. Guests began to arrive early, dressed in their finest, ready to sample the latest wines and enjoy the lavish event we had become famous for. The estate was alive with the buzz of conversation and laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of music in the background. But beneath the surface, I felt the tension building. Today was the day. Everything I had planned, everything I had worked toward, would come to a head in just a few hours. Clarissa moved through the crowd effortlessly, greeting guests, smiling, and laughing as if nothing was wrong. Luca arrived shortly after, his usual charming self, carrying the bottles of his latest vintage like they were prized treasures. He and Clarissa exchanged a knowing glance as he approached, a smile passing between them that made my blood boil. I watched them from a distance, keeping my expression neutral. No one suspected a thing. To the outside world, we were still the perfect couple, the power duo of the wine industry. But inside, I was seething, waiting for the right moment to pull the rug out from under them. As the evening wore on, the festival reached its peak. Guests moved from one tasting to the next, their glasses never empty, their spirits high. Luca's wine was the highlight of the night, as expected. People gathered around him, eager to sample his latest creation, while Clarissa stood by his side, beaming with pride. I watched them, my heart pounding in my chest, knowing that soon, their little world would come crashing down. Finally, the moment arrived. I stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, and called for the guests' attention. The chatter in the crowd quieted as everyone turned to face me, curious about what was happening. Clarissa stood in the front, Luca beside her, both of them smiling, unaware of what was about to unfold. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steady, thank you all for joining us tonight. This festival has always been a celebration of the finest wines and the people who create them. But tonight, we have something a little more special planned. I could see Clarissa's smile falter, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Luca glanced at her, then back at me, his expression unreadable. Good, let them wonder. As you all know, I continued, Luca has been a close friend and business partner of ours for some time now. His wines are truly remarkable, and we are honored to have him here tonight to showcase his latest vintage. There was polite applause from the crowd, but I wasn't finished. In fact, I said, my voice growing colder, Luca's presence here has been more impactful than any of you could imagine. You see, Luca hasn't just been sharing his wines with us. He's been sharing something far more personal. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Clarissa's face drained of color. She looked at me, wide-eyed, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. I reached behind me, pulling out a bottle of wine I had carefully prepared the night before. The label was simple, but the words printed on it were unmistakable. My last wine for the betrayed. I held it up for the crowd to see, then walked toward Clarissa. The room was deathly silent as I handed her the bottle. Her hands shook as she took it, her eyes filling with horror as she read the label. This, I said, my voice dripping with venom, is my final gift to the woman who thought she could betray me and get away with it. The crowd gasped. Clarissa stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes as she clutched the bottle. Unable to speak, Luca's face turned pale, his confident facade crumbling as the weight of what was happening sank in. And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It wasn't joy, not exactly. But it was something close. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The festival was ruined, our lives were shattered, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had finally regained control. The silence that followed my public revelation hung heavy in the air, like the suffocating weight of a storm after it has struck. Clarissa stood motionless, still clutching the bottle of wine, her knuckles white, her expression a mix of shock and horror. Luca, for all his charm and bravado, looked like a man who had been stripped bare, his mask shattered. The guests, too stunned to speak, exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to do or say. The festival had ground to a halt, and the joyful atmosphere that had once filled the vineyard was gone, replaced by a suffocating tension. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The destruction I had wrought was total, and there was a part of me that relished it. This was what they deserved, Clarissa, for betraying me, and Luca, for daring to come into my life and take what was mine. They thought they could live out their affair in secret, that no one would ever know, but now everyone knew. There was no escaping the truth. As the crowd began to stir, whispers spread like wildfire. Some people hurried toward the exit, not wanting to witness the fallout any longer. While others stayed rooted to the spot, their curiosity overpowering their discomfort. Clarissa, finally regaining some semblance of composure, turned to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. How could you do this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Here? In front of everyone? I stared at her, my heart cold. How could I not? You didn't seem to care about everyone when you were sneaking around with him, did you? Her face crumpled, and she looked down at the bottle in her hands. Luca took a step toward her. His face pale, but he stopped when he saw the expression on my face, a silent warning that if he moved any closer, I wouldn't hesitate to make this even worse for them. Clarissa's voice broke the silence again. Thomas, please, can we talk about this in private? Private? I scoffed. You mean the way you and Luca handled things? Behind closed doors, where no one could see? No, Clarissa. There's no more hiding. Everyone here knows what you've done now. Luca tried to speak, his voice calm but laced with desperation. Thomas, listen, this wasn't. Shut up, Luca, I snapped, cutting him off. You've said enough. You had no problem charming everyone at this festival, but let's see how charming you are now that they know who you really are. I could see the crowd shifting, some guests stepping back, not wanting to get involved in the unfolding drama. But there was no escaping it now. My world had already crumbled, and I was determined to take them both down with it. Clarissa took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she set the bottle down on the nearest table. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the murmurs of the crowd. I never wanted it to get to this. I stared at her, feeling a flicker of something, regret, maybe? Sadness? But it was quickly extinguished by the anger that still coursed through me. She had made her choices, and now she was going to live with the consequences. Without another word, I turned and walked off the stage, leaving Clarissa and Luca standing there, exposed in front of the world. The night was over for me. There was nothing left to salvage. I didn't go home that night. After I left the festival, I drove aimlessly for hours, the events of the evening playing over and over in my mind. The satisfaction I had felt during the public reveal was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness. I had imagined that exposing Clarissa and Luca would bring me some sense of closure, but now that it was done, all I felt was loss. The vineyard had been our shared dream, and now it felt tainted by the betrayal that had unfolded within its walls. I knew I couldn't stay there, not after everything that had happened. The memories were too fresh, too painful. Every corner of the estate would remind me of what I had lost, both the life I had built with Clarissa and the trust that had been shattered. I spent that night in a small hotel just outside the city. The room was simple, but it gave me the solitude I needed. I couldn't face anyone, not yet. The weight of the betrayal still hung over me, and I knew that the fallout from the festival would continue for days. Weeks, maybe even months. Clarissa and Luca's names would be on everyone's lips, their affair the scandal of the year. And I would be at the center of it all, the wronged husband who had exposed their secret for the world to see. But as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, what now? What was I supposed to do next? I had spent so much time planning their downfall that I hadn't stopped to think about what would come after. The vineyard, the business, the life I had built, it all felt meaningless now. The next morning, I woke to a barrage of missed calls and messages. Clarissa had tried to reach me several times, but I ignored her calls. I wasn't ready to talk to her, not yet. There were messages from friends and colleagues too, most of them expressing shock or offering their support. I read through a few of them before tossing my phone aside. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want to be the subject of everyone's pity. By the time I returned to the vineyard later that day, the festival grounds had been cleared, the guests long gone. The place looked eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened. But the remnants of the previous night lingered in the air, the tension, the whispers, the betrayal. Clarissa was waiting for me when I walked into the house. She looked tired, her eyes red from crying, but there was a determined set to her jaw. I could tell she had been rehearsing what she was going to say. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I didn't respond at first, just stared at her, wondering how we had gotten to this point. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? The woman standing before me felt like a stranger, and yet, she was the person I had spent the last 10 years building a life with. "There's nothing left to say," I finally replied, my voice cold. "You made your choice." She flinched at my words but didn't back down. "Thomas, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." I let out a bitter laugh. "It just happened? That's what you're going with? You didn't just happen to sneak around behind my back for weeks, Clarissa. You made a decision, and now we both have to live with the consequences." She looked down, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I know, but I don't want to lose everything we've built. Please, Thomas, can we at least try to fix this?" I stared at her, my heart torn between anger and the lingering traces of love I still felt for her. Could we fix this? Could I ever trust her again? Or was everything truly beyond repair? Clarissa's plea echoed in my mind long after she spoke. "Can we at least try to fix this?" The words hung in the air like a question that had no real answer. Could we fix this? Was there anything left worth saving? I stood in the doorway, my gaze locked on her. This woman, who had once been my world, now felt like a stranger. The betrayal had severed something deep between us, something that had been built over years of love, trust, and shared dreams. And now, as I looked at her, all I could see were the cracks, the lies. The secrets, the broken promises. "You want to fix this?" I finally said, my voice low, almost hollow. "You think we can just go back to how things were? After everything?" Clarissa's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't back down. "No, I know we can't go back. But we can move forward. Together. We've been through so much, Thomas. We've built a life together. I don't want to throw that away." I laughed, a bitter sound that cut through the tension in the room. "You don't want to throw it away? What do you think you've been doing with Luca? You didn't just throw us away. Clarissa, you burned it to the ground." She flinched at my words, but I could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to give up easily. Maybe she still believed there was a chance that we could somehow rebuild what had been destroyed. But I wasn't so sure. I made a mistake, she whispered, her voice trembling. A terrible, horrible mistake. But I still love you, Thomas. I never stopped loving you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Love. That word had become so twisted in my mind since the affair. How could she claim to love me while sneaking around with another man? How could she claim to love me after everything she had done? I turned away from her, running a hand through my hair as I tried to steady my breathing. My emotions were a chaotic mess: anger, sadness, betrayal, confusion. I didn't know what to do, what to feel. Part of me wanted to walk out of the house and never look back, to leave her and everything we had built behind. But another part of me, an irrational, deeply wounded part, wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that maybe, somehow, we could survive this. But at what cost? I don't know if I can do this, I said quietly, not looking at her. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what you've done. Clarissa stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch my arm. I tensed at the contact, but I didn't pull away. I know it's going to take time, she said, her voice soft. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I don't want to lose you, Thomas. Please, just give us a chance. Her touch, once comforting, now felt foreign to me. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, unsure of what that even meant. Was I agreeing to try? Was I just too exhausted to argue anymore? I wasn't sure, but in that moment, I let it be. We'll see, I muttered, turning away from her. I need time. Clarissa nodded, relief flashing in her eyes. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. But as I left the room, the weight of her words lingered. I wasn't sure how much time, or effort, could repair the damage that had been done. The days that followed were a blur of awkwardness and tension. Clarissa and I barely spoke, and when we did, the conversations felt forced, unnatural, as if we were two strangers trying to figure out how to live together again. The silence between us was thick, almost suffocating. Every room in the house felt heavy with the unspoken words we were both too afraid to say. I threw myself into work at the vineyard, spending hours walking through the rows of grapevines, checking on the workers, overseeing every detail of the business. It was a welcome distraction, a way to escape the uncomfortable reality waiting for me at home. But even the vineyard, my sanctuary, had become tainted by the events of the festival. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of what had happened. Luca's smiling face as he charmed the guests, Clarissa's laughter as she stood by his side, oblivious to the disaster about to unfold. The guests had long since left, the festival forgotten by most, but the scars it had left on me were fresh and deep. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind, the look on Clarissa's face when I handed her that bottle, the shock, the shame. It had given me some satisfaction at the time, but now it just felt hollow. What had I really gained from it? Clarissa kept trying to reach out to me, offering apologies, trying to engage me in conversations about our future, but I had no words for her. I wasn't ready to talk about the future. I wasn't even sure if we had one. One evening, a few weeks after the festival, I found myself standing in the vineyard at dusk, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the air cool and crisp. It should have been a peaceful moment, but instead, I felt a deep sense of unease. I had always loved this time of day, the quiet before nightfall, the way the vineyard seemed to come alive with the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. But now, it felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. Clarissa joined me a few minutes later, standing beside me in silence. I didn't turn to look at her, but I could feel her presence, her quiet desperation to fix things between us. She had been trying so hard, but I wasn't sure if her efforts were enough. I miss us, she said softly, breaking the silence. I miss the way things used to be. I closed my eyes, letting her words sink in. I missed it too. Our life before all of this. The laughter, the late-night conversations, the shared dreams. But that life felt so far away now. Like something that belonged to someone else. I miss it too, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Clarissa reached for my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't pull away. I let her take my hand in hers, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. Maybe it was the first step toward something, or maybe it was just a momentary lapse in my resolve. Either way, I let it happen. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For everything. I didn't respond, but I didn't need to. The weight of her words hung between us, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the depth of my own sadness, the grief for what we had lost. The vineyard stretched out before us, beautiful and untouchable, just like the life we had once built together. But now, I wasn't sure if that life was something we could ever get back. It had been weeks since the festival, and while Clarissa and I were still dancing around the ruins of our marriage, Luca had disappeared from our lives, or so I had thought. I hadn't seen him or heard his name mentioned since that night, and I had been content with the idea that he had vanished, leaving me and Clarissa to sort out our wreckage in peace. But life, as always, has a way of throwing you curveballs when you least expect them. I was at the vineyard, walking through the cellar with Daniel, my vineyard manager. We were discussing the next harvest season, the bottling schedule, and some new equipment we were considering purchasing. The conversation was routine, the kind of thing that had once brought me comfort, work, structure, a sense of control. But now, it felt more like a distraction than anything else. My mind was elsewhere, lost in the mess of my personal life. Then, as we rounded the corner, I saw him. Luca, standing in the doorway of the tasting room, talking to one of the employees like he had every right to be there. I froze, my heart slamming into my chest. What the hell was he doing here? Daniel stopped beside me, his brow furrowing in confusion. Isn't that? Yeah, I muttered, my voice tight with barely controlled rage. That's him. Without another word, I strode toward Luca, my blood boiling with each step. He turned as I approached, and the casual smile on his face faltered the moment our eyes met. Thomas, he began, his voice unnervingly calm. I was hoping to see you. I didn't stop walking until I was right in front of him, close enough to feel the tension radiating off both of us. What the hell are you doing here? I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. Luca held up his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to talk. Talk? I scoffed. You think we have anything to talk about? After what you did? Luca's expression shifted, a flicker of something like regret crossing his face. I know I screwed up. But I didn't come here to make things worse. I came to apologize. To both you and Clarissa. The mention of Clarissa's name set off a fresh wave of anger inside me. You think an apology is going to fix this? I spat, my fists clenching at my sides. You destroyed my marriage. You humiliated me in front of everyone I know. And now you just waltz in here, acting like everything's fine, like we can just talk this out? Luca's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. I'm not saying it's going to fix anything. I'm just trying to own up to my mistakes. I stared at him, my mind reeling. Was he serious? Did he actually think this was going to make a difference? The arrogance of it all, the sheer nerve, it was almost too much to process. Get out, I said through gritted teeth. Get out of here before I make you. Luca's eyes flashed with something, fear, maybe, or defiance. But he didn't argue. He nodded once, glancing past me toward the door. All right, I'll go. But for what it's worth, I am sorry. I didn't respond. I didn't care about his apology. As far as I was concerned, he could take his guilt and shove it. I watched as he turned and walked out of the tasting room, his footsteps echoing off the stone floors. The door closed behind him with a soft click. And then he was gone. Daniel, who had been watching the whole exchange in silence, finally spoke. You want me to make sure he stays gone? I shook my head, running a hand through my hair as I tried to calm the storm inside me. No, just let it go. But even as I said the words, I knew I wasn't letting anything go. Luca's sudden reappearance had thrown everything into chaos again. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure what his real motives were. Apologies were one thing, but I knew there had to be more to his visit than just guilt. Something told me this wasn't the last I'd see of him. Later that evening, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine as I tried to make sense of the day. Luca's visit had rattled me more than I wanted to admit, and the confrontation had left me on edge. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering what his real intentions had been. Why now? Why come back after weeks of silence, just to say he was sorry? It didn't make sense. I was lost in thought when Clarissa walked in. She had been distant all day, sensing the tension in the air but not knowing the source. Now, as she entered the kitchen, I could see the concern on her face. Thomas? She asked softly, her voice careful. Is everything okay? I didn't answer right away, just stared at the wine swirling in my glass. Luca was at the vineyard today. Clarissa froze, her hand gripping the back of a chair for support. Luca? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. What did he want? He said he came to apologize. I replied, my tone bitter. As if that's going to change anything. Clarissa swallowed hard, her eyes flickering with a mix of fear and guilt. She stepped closer, but I held up a hand to stop her. Don't. She paused, her expression pained. Thomas, I didn't know he was coming. I haven't spoken to him since the festival, I swear. I looked up at her, my eyes searching hers for any sign of deception. I believe you, I said finally. But that doesn't make this any easier. Clarissa bit her lip, her eyes filling with unshed tears. I don't know what to say. I didn't ask for any of this. I never wanted it to turn out like this. I set my glass down, the anger that had been simmering all day bubbling to the surface. Then why did you do it, Clarissa? Why him? Why throw everything we had away for some fling with a man like Luca? She closed her eyes, the tears spilling over now. I don't know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was lonely, Thomas. I felt like I was losing you. Like we were drifting apart. And then Luca came along, and he made me feel seen. Like I mattered again. Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. I had suspected for weeks that there had been more to her affair than just physical attraction, but hearing her say it out loud, admitting that she had felt something deeper for Luca, it was almost too much to bear. So what? I demanded, my voice rising. You felt neglected, so you decided to cheat on me? That's your excuse? Clarissa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't like that. I wasn't thinking clearly. I know I hurt you. I know I broke your trust. But please, Thomas, you have to believe me, I never meant for it to go this far. I stared at her, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and sorrow. And yet, it did. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of her words hanging between us like a dark cloud. I wanted to scream, to rage at her for what she had done, but the truth was, I was just tired. Tired of the lies, the betrayals, the constant ache in my chest. Clarissa took a tentative step toward me, her voice barely a whisper. Can we fix this? Can we find a way back to each other? I didn't answer. I didn't know the answer. All I knew was that the woman standing before me was no longer the same woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. And the man I had become. I wasn't sure if he was capable of forgiving her, or of finding his way back to the life we had once shared. The days after my conversation with Clarissa dragged on in a haze of emotional exhaustion. We lived under the same roof, but it felt as though we were trapped in different worlds, each too far from the other to reach. Her confession had left a mark deeper than I realized, stirring old wounds that hadn't yet healed. I'd replayed her words in my head over and over, wondering if there was any truth to them, wondering if I had really driven her into Luca's arms. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The idea that I might have had a hand in my own betrayal. But even if there were cracks in our marriage, that didn't justify what she had done. What Luca had done, every thought of him, every flash of his face, sent fresh anger coursing through me. I tried to stay busy at the vineyard, but the peace I used to find in my work was gone. Instead, there was only restlessness. And with that restlessness came the need to do something. I couldn't just sit back and let Luca get away with what he'd done. There had to be consequences. Then it hit me. The vineyard, the festival, they were the stage of his betrayal, and they could be the stage of my revenge. The idea formed slowly at first, but as the pieces began to fall into place, my resolve hardened. I couldn't simply walk away from this. Clarissa's affair had been public in a way that left me humiliated and exposed, but I had the power to turn the tables. I could expose them, both of them, on my terms. The upcoming festival presented the perfect opportunity. It was only weeks away, and once again, the vineyard would be filled with familiar faces, friends, colleagues, people who had whispered behind my back after the last festival's events. If I played my cards right, they would see something entirely different this time. They would see Luca for who he really was, a manipulator, a snake who preyed on vulnerable women. And Clarissa would have to face the consequences of her actions in the most public, unforgiving way possible. But I couldn't just make a scene. No, it had to be more subtle than that. Something theatrical, something that would leave a lasting impression. I spent days planning every detail, working late into the night. Refining my strategy. I enlisted Daniel, my vineyard manager, to help with logistics, though I didn't tell him everything. He didn't need to know the full extent of what I was planning. I would stage the perfect act of revenge, and when it was over, everyone would know the truth. Everyone would know who Luca really was, and what kind of person Clarissa had become. As the festival drew closer, my nerves started to settle. For the first time since I discovered the affair, I felt a sense of control. A sense of purpose. I had a plan, and I would see it through to the end. But even as I threw myself into the preparations, a small, nagging doubt remained at the back of my mind. Was this really the way forward? Was revenge the answer? Or was I just prolonging the pain, dragging it out instead of letting go? I didn't know the answer. All I knew was that Luca and Clarissa had taken something from me, something precious, and I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. The day of the festival arrived, and the vineyard buzzed with activity. Guests filtered in throughout the afternoon, their laughter and conversation blending with the soft music drifting through the air. It was a perfect day, clear skies, warm sunshine, the smell of fresh grapes hanging in the breeze. If you didn't know any better, you'd think it was just another idyllic celebration at the vineyard. But I knew better, and soon, so would everyone else. I stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching as guests moved from one tasting station to the next. Their wine glasses clinking as they sampled the latest vintages. From a distance, I could see Clarissa mingling with some of the guests. She looked radiant, like the perfect hostess she had always been. But beneath the surface, I knew she was as fragile as the glass she held in her hand. I had barely spoken to her in the days leading up to the festival. There was no need. She sensed the tension in the air but didn't push. Maybe she thought we were slowly healing, that the worst was behind us. She had no idea what was about to happen. I scanned the crowd, my eyes searching for Luca. He had to be here somewhere. He wouldn't pass up an opportunity like this. Sure enough, I spotted him near the wine cellar, talking to one of the guests. He looked every bit the charming winemaker, his smile easy, his posture relaxed. The man could sell wine to anyone. But today, he wasn't here to sell anything. He was here to face what was coming. My stomach churned as I watched him, but I didn't let it show. I had to stay calm, composed. This was a performance, and I couldn't break character. Not yet. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the vineyard, I knew it was time. The crowd was gathered in the courtyard, waiting for the traditional toast that always marked the highlight of the festival. I stepped up to the center, holding a bottle of my latest vintage, a special release, one that had been saved for this very moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to share this festival with so many friends, family, and supporters of the vineyard." The guests quieted down, turning their attention to me. Clarissa was near the front, her eyes locked on mine. Luca stood not far behind her, his expression unreadable. "I've been working on something special for this year's festival," I continued, holding up the bottle. "A wine that embodies everything we've worked for, our passion, our dedication, and our commitment to excellence. It's called The Last Vintage." A ripple of curiosity spread through the crowd. The name wasn't on the tasting list, no one had heard of it before. But they were intrigued. I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "And now, I'd like to invite someone very special to join me for the first tasting of this wine." "Clarissa?" Clarissa blinked, startled. She hadn't expected this. Slowly, she stepped forward, her face pale as she approached me. The crowd watched, curious, unaware of the tension between us. I handed her a glass, my eyes never leaving hers. "This is for you, Clarissa. My last gift to you. The last vintage." Her hand trembled as she took the glass, her confusion evident. But she didn't say a word. She couldn't, not here, not now. As she raised the glass to her lips, I turned to the crowd, my voice ringing with finality. "And to all of you, thank you for being part of this journey. May this wine remind us all that sometimes, the sweetest things are born out of bitterness." Clarissa's hand froze in midair, her eyes wide as realization dawned on her. But it was too late. The performance had begun, and there was no turning back now. As the toast hung in the air, the crowd erupted in applause, but the tension between Clarissa and me was palpable. She lowered her glass without tasting the wine, her hand trembling. The shock was plain on her face, but she was doing her best to maintain composure under the gaze of so many eyes. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times. But seeing her reaction in real time sent a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow through me. This was my victory, but it didn't feel like one. Luca stood in the back, his expression sharp. He knew something was off, though he hadn't yet grasped the full extent of what was happening. I could see him scanning the scene, his eyes darting from me to Clarissa and back again. It was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The crowd, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents, continued to sip their wine, complimenting the new vintage. I could hear snippets of conversation around me, praise for the wine, admiration for the event. It was almost surreal. Here they were, enjoying themselves, while just beneath the surface, everything was falling apart. I stepped closer to Clarissa, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "Do you understand now?" I asked, my tone cold, devoid of the affection I once had for her. "This was never about the wine. It's about showing everyone what you've done. What you and Luca have done." Her eyes widened, and she took a half step back, her breathing unsteady. "Thomas, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her mask of control slipping. I leaned in, my voice like ice. "You'll see." At that moment, Daniel, who had been coordinating the event, gave me a nod from the side of the courtyard. Everything was set. I turned back to the crowd, raising my glass again. "Before we continue the festivities, I'd like to introduce someone very important. A man who's contributed not only to this event but to a part of my personal life as well. Luca, please come forward." A murmur spread through the guests as Luca hesitated, but he couldn't refuse the invitation in front of everyone. He pushed through the crowd, his charming smile plastered on his face, though his eyes were wary. He had no idea what was coming. As he reached the front, I held out the bottle of wine I'd presented to Clarissa, the last vintage, and offered it to him. "Luca, this bottle is a tribute to you, for your contributions to the vineyard. It's a special blend. Why don't you tell everyone what you think?" He hesitated, glancing briefly at Clarissa, whose face had turned an alarming shade of pale. But under the watchful eyes of the crowd, he couldn't refuse. He took the bottle, pouring himself a glass with practiced ease. His hand was steady, his mask firmly in place, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, doubt. He raised the glass to his lips and took a sip. His smile froze for the briefest of moments, and I could see him trying to maintain his composure. "It's interesting," he said finally, the strain in his voice barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know what to look for. I stepped closer, my voice just loud enough for the front rows of guests to hear. "Oh, I'm sure it's interesting, Luca. After all, this wine, like you, has been carefully crafted over time, aged in secrecy, away from prying eyes. But there's one thing about it you don't know." He turned to me, his eyes narrowing, a question forming on his lips. But I didn't give him time to ask it. "This vintage," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "was made from the grapes grown in the same soil where our vineyard's foundation lies. The same place where I built everything I have. And just like this wine, Luca, your presence here has been an act of careful manipulation." The crowd had fallen silent, sensing that something was amiss. Luca's smile had faltered completely now. His eyes darting to Clarissa, who stood frozen, her glass clutched tightly in her hand. "And like the grapes crushed to make this wine," I continued, my voice colder with every word, "you've crushed something far more valuable to me. You've taken what wasn't yours." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the weight of my words sank in. Clarissa's face was a mask of horror, and Luca stood frozen, caught in the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, turning back to the crowd, "allow me to introduce Luca. The man who, in his infinite charm, has been involved with my wife behind my back. For weeks, while we've prepared for this festival, they've been sharing more than just wine." A wave of whispers swept through the audience, the guests shifting uncomfortably as the revelation hung in the air. Clarissa's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the stone courtyard with a piercing crash. She didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was as if she was paralyzed by the weight of her own guilt. Luca, on the other hand, regained his composure quickly. He straightened up, his face hardening as he looked at me with barely concealed contempt. "This is between you and your wife, Thomas," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've made your point. Now let's not turn this into a spectacle." But it was too late for that. The spectacle had already begun. The crowd was in uproar, murmurs of shock and disbelief filling the air as the revelation of Clarissa and Luca's affair settled over them like a dark cloud. I stood there, watching as my carefully orchestrated moment of revenge played out before me. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized that something wasn't quite right. The satisfaction I had expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, I felt empty. Clarissa, still standing in the center of the courtyard, looked as though she might crumble at any moment. Her hands were shaking, and she didn't dare meet my eyes. Luca had already stepped back, retreating from the harsh gaze of the crowd. His face unreadable. This was the moment I had waited for, planned for. But standing there, watching the two of them drown in the consequences of their actions, I felt no sense of triumph. Just a hollow void where my satisfaction should have been. The whispers from the crowd grew louder, and I could see people exchanging glances, some of them looking at me with pity, others with discomfort. This wasn't what I had envisioned. I had wanted them to see Luca and Clarissa for what they were, betrayers. But now it felt like I was the one on trial, exposed and vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. Clarissa finally moved, turning to me with tear-filled eyes. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." Her words hung in the air, empty and meaningless. There was nothing left for her to say that could change what she had done. I had thought that hearing her apology, seeing her brought low in front of everyone, would give me some measure of closure. But it didn't. It only made the weight on my chest feel heavier. Luca, standing just a few feet away, watched the scene with cool detachment. He was the same man who had seduced my wife, who had betrayed me in the most personal way possible. But now, standing before me, he seemed small, insignificant. His power over me was gone. I had exposed them both. I had laid their sins bare for the world to see. But as the crowd dispersed, uncomfortable and unsure of what to do next, I realized that revenge hadn't brought me the peace I craved. Clarissa stood before me, broken and lost. Luca had retreated into the shadows. And me? I was left alone with the wreckage of a life that had been shattered long before this moment. I had won the battle, but in the end, I wasn't sure I had won anything at all.